Good evening, everyone. Oop. Good evening, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Is it okay? Bonsoir à tous. My name's Julie Chamagne, and it's my privilege to be the CEO here at the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21. We are in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, and it's in the spirit of their welcome that I welcome you all here this evening for what promises to be a remarkable and wonderful evening. Canada's Storytellers is a series of encounters with authors and their books, with dance makers, and others who fall into what we call the narrative arts, art forms that in one way or another tell stories. I love this series. I love books. I'm always amazed by people who write them. And sometimes the authors that we invite are authors of fiction, who weave their stories from the fabric of their lived experience together with their imaginations. Tonight, we welcome Jaivet Ealom, whose story is all too true. It's one of those stories that if it were fiction, you almost wouldn't believe it. It is a story that is incredibly, dare I say, compelling, and one that leaves us in this country richer because somebody said yes at a border. And it is an honor to have Jaivet here tonight. I got to spend a wee bit of time with him today, convincing him that Halifax is indeed the next best city for him if he ever chooses to leave Toronto. We should all try to do that over the course of the evening afterwards, during the book signings and things. And speaking of that, there will be an opportunity to purchase books tonight and have them signed. I think he wants to stay in university. We have a few good ones here. He'll be joined tonight by Julie Chamagne, our friend of the museum, colleague and partner of the museum. Julie's the director of the Halifax Refugee Clinic. And so they're going to have a conversation tonight. And Julie's worked in asylum law overseas, including in Paris with Amnesty International. So a great pair to have this conversation with us this evening. She's been an advocate for migrant and refugee rights for the past 2 decades, which doesn't seem right mathematically, but we're grateful to have you here again, back again. Thank you. Also, thanks so much to Rebecca Mackenzie Hopkins, who brings these marvelous evenings together for us, and we're forever grateful for that. And lastly, thank you all for being here. So tonight, Julie and Jaivet are going to come up and have a conversation. There's going to be an opportunity for questions, and like I said, after that, there's an opportunity to proceed outside to have books signed. So without further ado, I want to welcome you both to the red chairs for the evening. I'm not sure why I have the clicker. Where did I put the clicker thing?
So hi everyone and welcome. I'm going to start with a reading. Spoiler alert, I didn't write this book. I'm going to die tonight. I'm going to die tonight. I was sad to realize I'd never feel the sun again. Most likely none of us would. It was past midnight and I'd had time to think things through. I accepted the finality. I was at peace. Crouched around me in the darkness were 100 men, women, and children. The wind howled and the air grew louder with the cries of desperate souls. Like me, they could see the world ending. Young families prayed together, united in their terror and grief. A mother clutched a baby close to her chest, looking at her child for perhaps the last time, a silent farewell. Next to her, a group of men, fathers, sons, survivors, tried to project strength and calm. Others wept loud and long. They had made it this far only to die on the relentless waves. Lost to history, soon to be forgotten, their stories would never be written. For all the desperation and pleas for help from God, it had fallen strangely quiet inside my head. I'd somehow managed to turn down the noise and switched off the lights so I could have a final, frank conversation with my soul. So Jaivet, that's a really powerful prologue, and your story was written. And I wanted to know how you feel about this passage in particular, almost a decade on.
At the time, I think I thought it was only my experience and what I went through, what I have seen through. But as more and more I became involved, that I'm not in a survival mode anymore, I started to realize this is pretty much the story of like others who have made the same journey or similar journey, regardless of the time. And it's a stark, like, it's almost like you won't believe like how similar it is that with others who didn't get to put their stories into words. So it's kind of make me, in a sense that I don't want anybody else to go through the same thing that I went through. So like realizing that there are other stories similar to that was sad, but at the same time, it's kind of bring relief that like at least I was able to relay their voices, like which some of them didn't make it, some of them made it, but not very well.
Yeah.
So it's a conflicting.
Yeah, like a solidarity, but then a very shared negative experience around the world and also through time. I know we were talking earlier about the museum and the exhibits and the fact that not that much has changed in 100 years.
Yeah, I think we would like to think that a lot has changed. Like the technologies are not the same anymore. A lot of laws has changes, but how little has changed. I was actually surprised by myself, like when I was going through the museums, like how much it is similar to the journey with people who have made it decades, if not like a century ago. And I was surprised by myself, actually, and it was.
Yeah. And I think there are a lot of parallels as well with, with your detention and with the experiences of people in World War II. I know a big part of this story was this book that you had with you that you basically had to hand bound, The Man's Search for Meaning. So can you tell me a little bit about that parallel and how that kind of helped you, cope with things?
Sure. This will sound like a joke, like you reading somebody else who survived the Auschwitz in a similar environment. That's kind of like funny thing to itself. But so when I was leaving, I didn't escape like on plan. It was like kind of a rush at the end. So if there is one thing that I wish I would have bought, it was like that book. So the book was a book named In Search of Meaning by Viktor Frankl, who was a Auschwitz survivor. And at the time, we were not allowed any books inside the detention. It was like so punitively designed that like you will go crazy on your own. So even like there were cigarettes, but there was no books. So I had this Salvation Army worker like who said I'm not allowed to give you a book because there was a different worker, her colleague, who got fired 2 weeks before for giving a toothbrush. So she said, but I could give you an e-copy which like you can read on the computer, which we had like 30 to 45 minutes every 2 weeks, and you were also allowed to print 5 pages, but intended for documents. So I just took the opportunity to print 5 pages every fortnight, and then until at first I got frustrated because I will print 5 pages and then I'll finish it reading within 1 day, and then later I learned how to discipline myself and wait until I print the whole book. It took me a few months to print the book, and then and there was this sewing places where you can go and sew your torn clothing. So I went there and then managed to get some help and sew the books.
Wow.
So that's where I read.
You can add bookbinder to the list of your many accomplishments. Right?
And then I learned a great deal from Victor as well. I think partly thanks to him, before the book and before realizing how to separate the physical pain from mental pain. I think it was a huge change of perceptions because of the physical pain and the torture you were put in. You could barely focus anything. You could barely do anything. But by the time I learned how a person can separate their physical pains with their inner self, which was that sense of Victor book. Like they can take everything away from you. They can take, for example, in my case, my name was taken off from day one. I became EML019 until the last day. Your dignity, individuality was like removed completely. So like what I learned from Victor was like, doesn't matter how much power like the captor holds on you, they can't take away your very inner self. Like you want the minute you realize or you learn how to separate the two, I think you have this inner born freedom of like, even though the guard treat you like horrible, it is still in your control how to respond to it. The situation doesn't matter how horrible it is. Once you have found that inner freedom, you learn how to respond to it. So that kind of gave me like a newly found like freedom to focus things, and then like and eventually taking things on my own hand.
That's incredible. On that same theme, I think something that really struck me, because as a refugee and migrant serving organization, we've represented people and advocated for people and support people in immigration detention, and there were a lot of similarities that I saw. I think, in particular, you were talking about how, just as you said before, you weren't allowed any books, you had nothing to do, so you would think that all you have time for is thinking, but that you can't actually reason, that there are, the confines of your perception, I guess, are mental, but also, physical. I think that was that when you were detained first at Christmas Island, that you had that realization, and that, that's something that I've certainly seen with our clients over the years, that inability to have perspective and reason and strategize. So I think you kind of answered my question by talking about the man's search for meaning and using that as a coping mechanism. But how else did you get over what is essentially torture? I think detention is torture. So what were your coping mechanisms for that? How did you?
Let me touch a little bit to a point you mentioned earlier, the physical confinement. I think I imagine it will be really hard for people who never go through detentions or prisons. And it's actually people like in immigration detention and other prisons, the actual torture is the one you can see. It's like this physical confinement. I never thought I would lose my sense of my ability to logically think and then like make sense progressively. And in detention, that physical confinement it's applied equally onto your brain and onto your mind. You just can't think logically ahead. It's just like it's like a loop. You keep going back and forth, but get nowhere. And also similarly, the way detention work on your body also work the same thing in mind in terms of distance. Because you were so removed from everyone's you care and from everyone support you. In my case, it was on an island. Like we were for the first 3 years, 2.5, 3 years, we were like almost removed from civilizations, and that equally affect on your mental. Like you feel just removed from the entire world. And that connections, human to human connection, having a support base and we were not able to see like anything that's not obstructed by the fence. So it was like, as much as the detention apply to body, I think it would be fair to say it doubles on your mind. And then like you just can't think, can reason and feel cut out from pretty much everyone. And different people take different path, like how to cope with it. For example, I had friends who became extremely religious because they feel like that is the only way, and others who completely lost it. They were like, if there was a God, like this will never happen. The amount of like torture that was happening, the amount of injustice that was happening, it was like they just like lose faith in whatever they have because they believe, like started to believe like if there was a God, he will not look on this from above like this. So different people take different approach, but I think nothing can take you off that mental cage, which I found much more difficult to deal with than the physical cage. And that's something like I think people don't observe or like hard to put on paper because, oh, he's not like chained. But that fence, that unobstructed view, and sometimes people do crazy things too. Like there was like, and you develop a lot of dark jokes among yourself. And one time I remember a friend like who was counting the number of the nails that was on the roof, and then and I found somebody else like he didn't count it. He named individual. All of the nails have individual name. So like people scope differently, but there is nothing I think that will take that mental cage off.
Yeah. Speaking of humor, I really enjoyed the tone of the book and the flow and the depth, and also sometimes the kind of absurdity and the cheekiness. And there were a few very humorous parts of the book, and humorous in a kind of a, like true gallows humor should be, like in a biting and dark way. One of my favorite passages was about the coconut crabs. Can you tell me about the coconut crabs?
So on this island called Christmas Island, which was an outpost territory of Australia, like they were like, I think about, I can't even remember the exact number, but there were like some millions of crabs, coconut crabs on that island. And we were detained like inside a naval base in the corner of the island, and detained as if arbitrary, indefinite. Like we just don't know if or when ever we will get out. So we were like trying to cope with it, to take that in. And this was like, at a time you just arrive and like you were thrown into prisons. Like, and to me it was like, I thought I was getting to a place where I will stop running, and maybe for the first time like I start living. And then we were just thrown into detention. And that prison was like surrounded by these coconut crabs, which were like huge, if you ask me. There was like this big monster. And even before detention, I used to have this like fear of like anything that has more than 4 legs. That's not for me. I just like avoid them. And then like this coconut crabs has like all the legs, and they don't walk sideways like other crabs. They walk straight, like, which terrify me because I can't predict them anymore.
Oh, that's kind of eerie. I didn't even know that.
And then they were protected on that island. If you kill a crab, like I think the fine was 10,000 Australian dollar. And they have special passage, so they can pass avoiding the traffic. And they were protected. You are not allowed to eat. And we got lectured for it. You are not supposed to touch them. You are not supposed to hurt them. You are not supposed to everything. Meanwhile, there were like thousands of souls lying next to them without any due process, without any hope, detained arbitrarily without any answer. Like, why am I detained for? Like I tried to put this a little bit in the book. Like at first I was genuinely confused because I thought I was issued a paper that says detentions of non-citizens illegal arrivals, something similar. And I read with my best English at the time, and like I was confused. I went up to the immigration officer. There's like something is wrong, I think, with the paper. Like I didn't do anything. Like you just can't detain me anything. And then I thought I came to claim asylum, but let me just, do that first, and then like deal with it. And then like they just, shrug you off and like and go, we will deal with it. You're not in a position. But at the same time, we were like, everything that we have at that time were like stripped off. Meanwhile, these coconut crabs like enjoy the highest protections on the island.
Yeah, the cruel irony and the absurdity of these, nothing against coconut crabs, but yeah, these coconut crabs having freedom of mobility and movement and this kind of protected status, while you as humans are detained and not even allowed to lodge that asylum claim right away. Anyway, that was a really like a really pithy and great passage in the book. So I want to touch on something that you mentioned. You said you went up to this immigration officer and showed this paperwork. Obviously, you've had so many processes throughout this journey, so many people in positions of power, authority figures, and also in professional, in helping roles, obviously. And what is very interesting to me in general and was a big theme in the book for me is how people in positions of authority or power, or even in their professions, balancing their moral obligations and their professional obligations, how people use that discretion to either wield power and oppress or to do. And there were some very big transgressions of professional boundaries, which I found great. In the book, in terms of making sure you had a safe passage, but how do you explain that, and how did you experience that?
This is something I learned purely from talking to prison guards and other who works in the detention system. I think we human as an individual, there are things that we will not do if we feel like we are responsible for entirety of it. But we would do if that responsibility was removed from us, and then say, I'm just doing the job. If I don't do it, somebody else would do it. Mm-hmm. It's just the organizations. I'm just a tiny bit of here. So that individuality was removed from the persons, and either it is the organization, the armed force, or the job aspect of it, and they would do it. But if you were to flip the coin, it's if you were the one making these rules, would you do it? I will never do such horrible things. And then if we look throughout the history, a lot of bad things were undertaken by organizations, mm-hmm. organized in an organized way, where I feel individual responsibility was removed from the person who was carrying on the order. I think that's how a lot of bad things happen in history, and that was pretty much true in the case of the prisons and the detentions subsequently. Mm-hmm. And equally, the other side is also true. So I got detained by put in the prisons for 4.5 years by the Australian government, but at the same time, the person who helped me to escape were also Australians, mm-hmm. worker of the detention, who work for the prisons as well. So as much as the bad peoples, aka are peoples who don't feel that, the responsibility have discretions to make things horrible in that moment, have equal opportunity to make that the pleasant. There's like every role, like you have like certain discretionary space that you can move to make one thing's better or the other, and it makes all the changes. So specific examples of that the other way is like when I first arrived in Canada, I was running from a prison. And for the last 4.5 years, for me, this was always true even in Burma, but at that moment specifically, before it was green army uniform, which was the Burmese regime at the time, mean oppression, mean they're coming to get you. But the prison taught me like not just green army uniform, but any uniforms equal brutality. So like, and then when I was I arrived at the airport, I was mentally and physically prepared to go through the same process that I went in Australia, which was like I was welcomed with a strip search, and then like put a number, and then like from then on the name was gone. So I was preparing myself physically and mentally to go through the same process. And here I met an immigration officer who changed like the pretty much what follows and my perceptions of the country like as a whole, who kind of brought me to an office and then like put me down, asked me to sit, and then he left. Like this was from the beginning when I arrived, I told him like the passport I'm carrying is not genuine, like yada yada. I gave him like pretty much whatever happened at the moment, and then he left. I was pretty convinced that like he's calling for backup, and then like so that they could be able to put me somewhere. And then like after a few moments, he arrived with holding a Subway sandwich. And then he said, earlier I mentioned like I couldn't stand pretty straight because I haven't eaten like for 3 days at that moment, at that point. And I was bending a little bit because of the stomach acid built up. And then like he said, I can't just question somebody who is in hunger. The kitchen is closed, it is past midnight, but here's a sandwich, eat it, then we will talk. To me, that was like I had a hard time believing that was really happening. I couldn't tell the difference because I was hallucinating because of the lack of foods and lack of sleep for the last 3 days, or it was actually happening. So I think I'm pretty sure that officer was not supposed. He bought the Subway sandwich, by the way, with his own money because the kitchen was closed. And I'm pretty sure like that's not the work protocol that you were supposed to follow.
And because you had arrived essentially with a fraudulent passport or undocumented, he could have detained you as well.
I believe that's pretty much the protocol. Anybody, he actually, later in the interview, he told me like anybody who arrived with a passport that's not under their name or with a document that's like not genuine, the default protocol is like to send to detention. And there was like one uniforms who is a stranger to me at the time. And I was a stranger to them. And then like
that's a good example about how he, within his existing discretion, how he used that, how he managed his discretion. And it's, I mean, as I see in our work, when people arrive after harrowing journeys and expect refuge and sanctuary and a welcome and then are put in detention, it's incredibly difficult for them, for their mental health, obviously, and also their relationship with this country that is supposed to protect them. So I'm certainly glad that didn't happen to you when you arrived, especially having been detained so much. In the book, you talk a lot about language and the power of words, and that words have consequences, and they can be used, stoke political feelings in a bad way, kind of like the discretion thing we were talking about, and then they can be used to downplay things. Like I think you were talking about, I don't remember what it is now, but that it made this essentially detention center sound like a chalet in Switzerland by putting the word house after it. I thought that was very kind of poignant to see how you can downplay things as well as like stoke things up. But it's clear from your story that you also have had to learn different languages and code shift a lot and learn dialects. So tell me a little bit more about how language has played a role in your life and in this journey here.
Yeah, I think to your earlier point, I think in ordinary day, as an ordinary public, I think we don't pay much attention to the language like crafted on a label put on certain status of the people. Mm-hmm. But in reality, if you were in my shoes or like anybody in my shoes, those words are just not words. They have like real life consequences. Yeah. And oftentimes those words, those labels were created by people who were at a privileged power, like at a privileged positions. And for examples, in my case, like during my imprisonment, we were at first called illegal arrivals and transitory persons and maritime arrivals, and then like later became like a never asylum claimers or like never refugee. Those words like never appeared. And the same goes with the prison. At first it was detention center, and later it became like processing center, and later on it became like transit center. So these labels were, as much as we would like to think, is just, I personally used to thought they were either coincidence or just like chaotic, like didn't put a lot of like thinking, but they were actually carefully crafted rhetoric used to justify one's political ambitions against other.
Yeah, that's something that you talk about throughout the book too. Is it an omission? Is it neglect? Or is it intentional? Just all of these, all of these little actions or all of these little decisions. Yeah, for sure. You spent your childhood and your youth obviously in Burma, and I think for me anyway, you do a great job of paying homage to Burma and to Rohingya culture. They're the proverbs that are peppered throughout the book. Oh, look. The proverbs that are peppered throughout the book, and also your your description of the Rohingya that you meet along the way in Manus and in Canada. What do you want your readers or your audience to take away from that, from your Rohingya culture, from your Burmese culture?
Yeah, I wanted to portray a little bit of, or shed a little bit of light on this. Oftentimes, I feel like a lot of the things we read, we hear, or we watch come through mass media or produced media like that. Oftentimes pass through a lot of filters, and by the time that voice or that image you reach the audience past those filters, the original essence was like pretty much taken, removed from it. So I wanted to give like a first person's experience of how it was like growing up in Burma, how it was like growing up under a regime, and how it was like growing up in a place, in a prison, open air prison, that was constantly shrinking from my grandparents' generation, from the being country to, by my time, it was just a 3 kilometer radius village. So I wanted to give a sense of Burma like this. Oftentimes, I think, not neglected, but there's nothing much that you can find on it. So I wanted to give like a on the ground, first-hand experience of it. But on the other hand, as as like I'm writing and like I'm living here, like it's how similar we each other are, despite being half across the world, despite being vastly different language, despite being vastly different cultures, yet the things we value at the end of the day are like how similar, how it will like, I think anyone who have never read through or who have never like been to Burma like will see like how similar it is. And I wanted to say at the end of the day, if we strip down the clothes and the culture and the like civilized clothing, is we all are the same person who value the same thing and who want pretty much the same thing in life. And I think I wanted to shed a little bit of light on that.
Yeah, I think you really did that, talking about, you know, your mother and your little brother too, your big brother, your brother anyway. Having left, you know, having been forced to leave essentially for your life and your future and your security of person. Then having spent all this time in, I mean, limbo is downplaying it, but just in these, you know, in this state of flight. It's been a few years since you've been here. What parts of your Rohingya and Burmese identity have stayed with you, and how do you, I guess my question is, how do you manage that? How do you reconcile that? What parts have stuck? What parts, you know, haven't?
Let me answer that into like two parts. The first part is like, I think it applied to anybody who didn't go through the same journey or who haven't fled the country. I started to believe that all of us don't know, like, regardless of however you wanted to word it, like, oh no, my culture is of this background, my culture is of that background. As we travel, we go around, I think we tend to lose a bit of like our own cultures and tend to pick up along the way like certain things, certain that, and then in that sense, each individual has like a individual culture surrounded us of things that we have left behind and of things we pick up along the way as we travel. So in that sense, it's like really unique to each person. And on the other hand, the culture, I was often like, I was often asked like yesterday, not yesterday, the day before yesterday, I was at this event, like I was asked like, oh, so even though I was a stateless from the very beginning, and then like you still use the hyphen, say Burmese Canadian, and there was other two people who were like, one was a Syrian Canadian and Palestinian Canadian. So do you still use hyphen? Does that mean you're still holding onto your, you know, former country or former cultures? Where for people who were forced to flee, it's just not that, I think, it's not that like we had a choice or like we intended to go to certain places. It was often like we just need to get away from that place. You just run from it. And then when you arrive to a new country, when you arrive to a new shore, it's not like you can just magically delete everything that happened to that point. And life doesn't start at the airport. Somebody's life doesn't start at the shore. Like, it is. And there are still a lot of cultural nuances, a lot of like things that I still go to and participate, but I don't actually believe in them anymore. But it is who I was, it is who I am, and it is who a lot of people I still connect to. It's like shared identity. Sometimes it is not as if there's a clear cut between either you take it or leave it. It's like sometimes it is nuances that you share as a cultural identity, not necessarily your identity.
Yeah.
So I still have like a lot of things that I participate, and I'm trying to, you know, make more time for it. But that were, if you were to ask me as an individual, removed from the culture, removed from the society, I probably won't do it. But as a shared identity, as a shared culture, so you can't just delete whatever happens and then like restart it.
No, and and I guess nor should you. this kind of attitude and this sentiment comes up sometimes when there is this, especially when you're dealing with a forced migration situation like yours was. There's a sentiment that now that you're here in Canada, you should move on, you should be grateful, and a kind of a misunderstanding of the real grief and the real loss of having to leave somewhere, even somewhere dangerous or somewhere where your life was at risk. And I find myself kind of coming up against that sentiment too. So it's a part of you. It's,
I mean, it's not that like we are not thankful. Like, I don't think I would ever be more thankful than a country, than a place that let me leave, like at time of danger, at a time of great necessity. It's just that like also acknowledging what was in the past, also acknowledging what things that have made you at that point. So it's not like not appreciations of the new lands or not appreciations of the new country, but it was, as I mentioned, it was this individual culture around you, things I left in Burma, things I pick up on the way to this, like all 6 countries across, and things I pick up here, and then like this individual culture. So it's like a holistic, it was like a whole thing. It's not just like you can cut out, hit delete, and start here. Now you're a Canadian. Drop the hyphen. Like, it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Speaking of things part of your experience and part of you, you talk about it in the book as well, and then you mentioned earlier that detention is torture. If you're comfortable, I'm wondering if you could tell me about some of the lasting effects of your period in detention.
So once you're in this, I think I often like to use the word institutionalized, when you are put in detentions, and from day one, your name is being removed. From day two, the prison decide what time you take shower, what time you eat, what time you go to sleep. And in our case, it was what time you use the bathroom. So every part of your, they make sure like every individual decision that you can make is like being taken away and then like is controlled. So you became like institutionalized, and things, and normal things could become trigger of, like, for example, some of the things that I was dealing with was, one thing was radio chatter. Like, anytime I hear a radio chatter, that's an indication that a prison guard is coming. And to this day, I still struggle, like whenever in the airport or like in any other places, as soon as I hear radio chatter, there's just memory flashing like back. And I also have quite a bit of a still trying to rewire my brain with the sirens. Whenever I hear sirens, like I hear somebody chasing me. Somebody is like chasing me down, and then like instead, now I'm trying to think of as if imagining a fire truck rushing to help somebody instead of a police. So it's changed certain aspect of like the way you see things. Also, sometimes it's not even conscious. It's like unconsciously it rewire your brain. That's why I wanted to you institutionalize so badly that the world look upside down. Now it is not an issue anymore, but at the beginning, I will struggle with any noises. Like the prison was like so calm and quiet in the middle of nowhere. The day I escaped, and I took this cab, that taxi driver is like, I was panicking and then like not processing the sounds of traffic. Like I almost gave him like everything I had to the taxi drivers, like without actually processing it.
Because it was so much for your system. That's when you went to Port Moresby. Yeah.
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 And also, I had a little bit of difficulties with the sugar at the beginning because there was no sugar. So as soon as I drink here, like I almost vomit. That sugar was so overwhelming.
Wow.
And a lot of like a lot of things that some things goes away, but some things it's really hard. And I hope with time it will goes away.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Thanks for sharing that. I think it's important that kind of talking about what you were saying earlier about transit centers, processing centers, that people understand that immigration detention centers, especially these ones where you were, but any immigration detention context is very rights abusive and mentally, and disastrous for people's mental health.
Especially, I feel like the detention that's immediately after your arrival is like by comparison, I would say it's like you wouldn't put a baby into a cage as soon as they were born, and it's like a person just arrived into the country, and the first thing you do was like send to detention.
And I think it's that, like you said, when you arrived in Canada, it didn't happen, but you kind of expected it to, right? Because you'd been through so much. But it's that expectation, and you must just be in this sense of just adrenaline and expectation, and you finally arrive, and you finally think you have a place that can protect you, that you've heard about for years. I'm sure our clients have this experience with Canada that they've heard about as a country that upholds human rights and refugee rights and is welcoming, and you've had this narrative about for so many years. In Australia, as you describe in the book, you had heard all these great things, and you finally got there. You risked your life, and on the first boat to not, and then to be brave enough to get into another boat again to do that, and then just that welcome or lack thereof, and that contrast is so, just must be so devastating. But then.
It at this very beginning, I think it has a lot of impact, the way it shaped for the rest of the experience in that specific case, whether it's Australia or Canada. And in my case, even though I didn't know pretty much roughly 24 hours before that I will be coming to Canada, but a line of questioning that I often face in immigrations and other detentions, like refugee hearing, was like, why did you choose Canada, or why did you choose Australia? And this is against the law, this is not the law, this is the way it is. And I think all I wanted to say is maybe you have never fled a country, but when you flee a country, you don't really care where you are going. You don't really care what sign you are, no trespassing signs or like private property signs. You don't really care. You don't really care any rule. You don't care any law. You just jump the fence that give you the highest chance of survival at that moment. So I don't know why I choose Canada, but I don't know why I choose Australia, but that definitely seems like the only place at the time that I have the chance of survival, the highest chance of survival. And I think this is something that people who have never been on the other side of the table would grasp it. But I wanted to say, like, every single time.
Yeah. As I said, I really enjoyed the book. But it must have been, maybe part of it was cathartic, but it also must have been really painful to write. You talk about this a little bit in the book, but my question to you now is what made you write this book, essentially?
A few things. Partly, I feel like I have a moral obligations to people. Like, I had 7 friends who were killed during the imprisonment years, during the 4.5 years, and hundreds that were being deported back to the dangers and died in the country of origin. And also just feel like I have like this obligation to tell the world like what actually happened, or / like to correctly record the fact that this is something actually happened. It's not just like remote, fictional, just because it happened on an island that has nothing, or 200 kilometers surrounding but water, removed from the society, removed from the civilization, removed from the news, removed from the press. It didn't matter. It's actually happened, and I feel like giving a tribute to my friends and people who didn't make it, and or people whose story will never be put into words or to record the facts properly. And I think I have. Do we still have time?
Yeah.
And I think I have put it like a little bit at the end of the book where I kind of I'm gonna just read the passage so that like it's, I think sometimes because I can go back and edit it, I write better than I talk like on the one sitting. My book has an ending, but the story doesn't. In Australia, at least, nothing much has changed, despite all the madness and suffering. While Manus Prison is gone, the offshore detainment system continues. Together, the terrible force of government ideology and media march in lockstep to trample the lives of the world's most vulnerable people. My wish is that this book, while keeping the reader interested, will draw some attention to this evil system, with the hope of one day bringing an end to it. My own journey to freedom was made possible by quiet individual who took a chance on me because they believed that doing so, helping even just a single person get to a better place, was worthwhile in itself. My ability to write this book is a testament to their courage and to the small actions that came together to point my way to freedom and save my life. A single person can make a difference through the smallest act of goodness, because small actions can come together to make great one. This is my hope, at least, whether it is Burma or Manus or some other totalitarian regime. The past does repeat itself, and the same narratives of oppressions occur in different times and places. At least, if the facts are properly recorded, there is a chance that someone will stumble across them at some future moment in history and say, not this time, not again. So I wanted to set the record properly, and I also wanted to give people who helped me along the way, who were like total stranger to me, but yet took a chance on me, though they will not realize how big of an impact it was. And the last reason was like I feel obligated to my friends and other people who are still in search of a safe home.
Well, I'm so glad you did. I really, it was really important to write this, I think, and as I was reading it, I was really, bearing witness to your journey and your story, but all the intersecting, stories that you told in different ways along the way. And I think it's fitting that we're at the museum as well tonight, which is just, a collection of these experiences, of these stories. And like we said when we started the conversation, that, these, it's all too familiar. But yeah, Jaivet, I want to thank you so much. I have been monopolizing Jaivet's time with my questions. So what I wanted to do now is ask the audience if you have any questions for him. I think we're going to do a Q&A. I mean, I'm happy to talk to him for the next 5 hours. It's great, but.
Sweet. Hello.
Hi.
My question for you is, so in your book, you mentioned different ways that therapists have helped you find strategies to cope with your PTSD, and you kind of mentioned that right now as well. I kind of wanted to ask you a more general question about now that since you've come to Canada, I'm wondering what self-care practices you regularly do now to take care of yourself.
I think I'm only functional on the day I meditate in the morning. Otherwise, I'm not functional in that day. I just feel like to feel grounded, I just need like that kind of meditation. That's something I should probably do more, but that's something like I need to do to feel functional on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. Can I ask another question? Can I ask you one more? I just have one more. Do you have any recommendations for healthcare providers, myself being a dietitian and a nurse, for working with a refugee population in Canada?
I held like, this access to food was being used as a weapon in the detention, so I'm like very skeptical against it. But oftentimes, I think there's a crazy story. Like I think we kind of talked this about earlier. Like the printer that I used to print the book, there were people who would print the food pictures and put it on the wall in their cell because you were so, food was such a, it was just so precious. Like at the time, people will print the food of their own, culture or their certain things and then like put on the wall. So I think food does play a great thing. And that's the last thing after your safety that cross your mind when in the places like detention where you have nothing to do. So I would often see come across people putting, shawarma to biryani to like a steak on the wall just to have that. And then that second thing is like oftentimes, this is like actually, I think a huge part of the conversation. If ever we get out, the first thing they will discuss is like the food they will make together. That's the first thing that they would say. There's a huge part of the conversation. You would think like, you would discuss of like things you would do if you ever get out, but no, food was like the first thing. And on the day that I actually managed to get out in my first arrival to Port Moresby, I was asked like the person who was helping me, like, what do you want? Like now that you're quote unquote away from the detention and free. And the only thing that I wanted was like a real cup of coffee because I didn't have coffee for the last 4.5 years. It was like fake coffee powder. All I wanted was a warm shower and a cup of coffee. So I think food does play a really big role, especially when you were denied it for so many years. I think that's a good way actually to, gradually introducing back to normalcy, back to the normal rhythm of the society when you were like isolated in a tiny prisons for so long. Thank you.
I could just be here forever asking questions, but I know that there is going to be is there a question? Okay, excellent.
Hello, it was enlightening to hear you speak, and you have talked about your experience in Australia and when you arrived here in Canada, but what was the triggering point when you left Burma? I mean, could you please enlighten us with your experience in Burma actually? And what was the actual triggering point that you decided to leave the country? I mean, I've read so much about the violence and torture in the country, but I would like to hear your experience.
Yeah, it was not one single triggering point, or it was my individual decisions. At the time before I left, it became like the genocide became like a full-fledged genocide where they were like burning entire villages, regardless of like even kids. And so we have this decision, collective decision where anyone could move, should move. Not that everybody was able to move. There was like, people who were too weak to move or disabled to move, or people simply just refuse to leave their home and their houses. So like it was a collective decision that whoever could move should move out of the country. And eventually, after we left, there were like well-documented cases of the regime shooting people in the back as they were fleeing. So it became like a matter of survival. But if you wanted to pick up one single triggering point, I think it was the violence became like indiscriminatory and physical violence. Before it was more of a structural measures put in place to restrict movements and to pocket of populations. But then by the time I left, it became like indiscriminatory against pretty much everyone who belonged to a minority.
Hello, thank you so much for your presentation. I think this experience is very universal, even though you talk particularly about the Australian Offshore Detention Centre. Is there anything that you think we can do as Canadians to put an end to detention practices in Canada and elsewhere?
Could you repeat the last part of the question, please?
The last part was, do you think there's anything that we can do as Canadians to put an end to this kind of detention practice, both in Canada and also in Australia?
I hope there shouldn't be I hope, like that's my hope, like there shouldn't be any detention, especially people who arrive with so much trauma and people who are fleeing. I don't think there is like, regardless of like wherever they're coming from, whoever there shouldn't be any detention, because there was a very vital period, like at the very first beginning in the country. It was almost like first impressions of a country. As soon as I arrived, like I was welcomed with a strip search in Australia, and then like the next thing was taken away my name. And I don't think anybody should go through that, and any country should practice like any policy like that. So I don't think there's the detentions of people seeking safety. That's how you should, anybody should treat somebody who is seeking help, like with imprisonment and with detention. And I hope that change soon. But as an individual, as I also I was making a few points in the book, but a lot of the way my stories end up, the way like I end up was like if it wasn't a single individual, a stranger to me, and I am a stranger to them, taking a chance on me without actually knowing my full story, without any expectations of like return or results, yet doing a gesture, doesn't matter how small it is, I think made a huge difference. And we often think we don't, our actions are so small. It's like it's such a small gestures. What is this gonna do? But I think the single most effective weapon against the system of oppressions like detention that I have found so far is our individual, like taking a chance on the strangers and exercising their discretionary power wherever they are, in line with their like moral ruler, not just like the descriptions of the rule or law. I have found that's the most effective weapon so far. I hope that detentions of refugees and asylum seekers will go away altogether. But until then.
I think it's really important to hear stories like yours and to hear stories from people who are in detention. And I'll just partly answer that question if that's okay to take your question. So Canada does detain people at immigration grounds. There are immigration holding centers, and Canada also detains people. There are agreements with the provinces to detain in provincial correctional facilities, so immigration detainees in provincial correctional facilities. And this year there has been an advocacy effort and more push, thanks to Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, to convince provincial governments to cancel their contracts with CBSA to stop housing immigration detainees in provincial jails. And BC was the first province to cancel its contract in July of this year, and Nova Scotia was actually the second, so we have 12 months left in the contract to ride out, but we've given notice to CBSA that we will no longer be detaining immigration detainees in provincial correctional facilities. Alberta and Manitoba have followed suit, so dropping like dominoes. But there is a campaign that's starting in a few weeks, actually. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and some advocates across the country to try to convince the federal government to cancel the remaining provincial contracts. And then ultimately, after that step is done, to make new policy, new legislation, and to abolish immigration detention. We're not quite there yet, but so there are a lot of things that we can do as individuals and as community members, like Jaivet was saying. It's our personal responsibility, and get involved with campaigns like that and inform ourselves and write to the minister. There's this push right now for that.
Just to clarify, are you talking about people who are claiming refugee status, or are you just talking about illegal immigration but not following the lines in the process?
Yeah, so I'm talking about people who are making refugee claims for protection, like when Jaivet arrived at the airport in Toronto in the book, as he described, and he didn't have proper identification, and he could have been detained on immigration grounds, even though he's coming to seek protection. So that could have been a situation, and thankfully he wasn't. But we see people coming in those circumstances, particularly if they arrive by boat, which is something we kind of talked about a little bit earlier too, that everybody is so afraid of boat arrivals. There are thousands of people coming through the airports, but there's this fear around people arriving at our shores by boat. So people asking for protection in that context, if they are considered a flight risk or a danger, or if they aren't found to have satisfied the minister as to their identity, they are detained. And that is, like you were talking about, getting to Australia that you thought was going to be your place of refuge and then being strip searched. Like it's the opposite of a welcome, and it's a very, very problematic and very traumatic, way to enter a country that you thought was going to be your refuge.
I personally feel like that boat versus plane is it's not outright racism, if not like outright discrimination. It's like a subtle form of discrimination that were put in place. Like you don't see it as a discrimination, at least in writing, because oftentimes people who are fleeing wars and genocide, they don't care if they're carrying their passport or not. They just like flee for their life.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, people who have access to proper passport, proper visa, and can afford a plane ticket are oftentimes like not the same peoples of caliber. And so it was like a measure put in place. Like in Australia, the same thing. At the same time, while they were detaining people who arrived by boat indefinitely, they were not detaining people who arrived by plane, because these are often, if not white but Europeans mostly could arrive in planes, like can get a visa, but that's not the case with, say, a passport like Burma. You don't get a visa to Australia, let alone, and the minorities like Rohingya, they were made a stateless forcibly, let alone have a passport. They don't even have a document or an ID to their name. And it was a subtle form of discrimination that was, I think, coded into law, which you can't outrightly point out it is a discriminatory policy, but it is in a subtle form of discriminatory policy.
Yeah.
I don't see any differences just because you use a plane versus you use a ship. I just don't see a difference that change somebody's situations back home.
Yeah. Yeah, that's...
The only thing I just wanted to distinguish was refugee claimant and someone just beating the borders without for financial gain or other reasons or the like. There's a big difference between a person running from the country under threat of life, and being stopped at the border and put into jail, than other situations where it's not a case where they're not a refugee.
Yeah, so just to clarify, it is including refugee claimants who come, obviously, other categories of foreign nationals, I guess is what they're called in the laws, who arrive would be subject to immigration detention as well. But it doesn't exclude refugee claimants, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, so I think we can wrap it up. I know that there's a book sale, and I really hope that everybody reads this. I can't recommend it highly enough. And Jaivet, thank you to you especially for writing this book and for coming and for speaking with us here tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you, Marie. And also thank you to, I was told that whoever is turning up in the audience are a core member of museum support group. I wanted to say thank you. These are something that should be preserved, and people, even though somebody like me who didn't realize much in the journey because I was in a flight or fight mode at the time, being able to look back and reflect on experience by visiting places like museum, I think this is something should get a lot more support. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you so much to the museum. All right. Well, I think that's good. Let's go to the other room.